Margaret Chase Smith was raised in the small town of Skowhegan, Maine. Because her family was relatively poor, she was never able to go to college. She was the first senator to stand up against McCarthyism, the first woman in the Republican or Democratic parties to run for president, and takes credit for paving the way for women in politics today. By the time her career was over, the woman who once desired to be a PE teacher would become a pioneer for women in national politics and reform the nation's conscience by following her own. In 1930, Margaret married Clyde Smith, a local politician. He once said, "I know of no one else who has the full knowledge of my ideas and plans, or is as well qualified as she is, to carry on these ideas or my unfinished work for the district." In 1940, he died of a heart attack. In June of 1940, Maine held a special election so that Margaret could fill her husband's seat in the House of Representatives. In 1948, she was elected into the Senate. She then became the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress.
Altogether, she serves 32 years in Congress, and she's really the first woman who's able to take that new right of women being able to vote and run for office and turn it into a career.
Early in her political career, she was interested in the military. In World War II, women were eventually allowed in the military, but only in special units.
Army, the Waves in the Navy, and the WAFs in the Air Force. And then after World War II was over, the plan was just to disband those units and get rid of the women. And Margaret didn't think that was fair, that if women had served during wartime, that they should be given opportunities afterwards. And the compromise was going to be that they'd be allowed to stay in, but only as temporary members, not as permanent members of the military. And Margaret thought that was wrong. And she fought for some legislation that eventually gets passed. I believe it was in 1948 during the Truman administration that allowed women to remain in the military as permanent members.
During this time, more and more countries had communist governments. It wasn't long before all of America was afraid of being overthrown by communism. If I am to be remembered in history, it will not be because of my legislative accomplishments, but for an act I took as a legislator in the United States Senate when on June 1st, 1950, I spoke in condemnation of McCarthyism. When the junior senator from Wisconsin had the Senate paralyzed with fear that he would purge any senator who disagreed with him.
She stood up in the Senate and gave a speech that became known as her Declaration of Conscience speech. And what she was responding to was what had begun happening in this country beginning in February of 1950 when Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin had started to go around the country waving pieces of paper saying he had proof that there were communists in our government. And people were very concerned about that, as was Margaret Chase Smith. But what she very quickly realized is that he really didn't have proof that there were communists in our government. What he had was lots of gossip and rumor and innuendo about people. And what she didn't like about McCarthy was the tactics that he used. He was a pretty classic bully, a political demagogue who was just trying to build his own career at the expense of other people. And she thought that those tactics were wrong. So she never mentions him by name in her speech. By criticizing the types of tactics that Joe McCarthy was using, it's very clear who she was speaking out against.
So for her to stand up and make that speech was very brave. But she did, and she had great reviews from it. Some people had said, I think it was Baruch who said that had it been a man who made that speech, he would have been the next president of the United States.
3 weeks after her speech, North Korea invaded South Korea, making the fear of communism in America greater and the will of people to follow McCarthy stronger. As revenge for Senator Smith's speech, McCarthy had her removed from one of her committees.
And the next time she ran for Senate in Maine in 1954, he handpicked a candidate to run against her. She very easily defeated that candidate, but he did make her life in the Senate miserable as much as he could.
McCarthy was voted out of the Senate on December 2nd, 1954. He was then very depressed and relied on alcohol, which on May 2nd, 1957 killed him. 7 years later, at a Women's National Press Club meeting, Margaret Chase Smith announced she was running for president.
There are those who make the contention that no woman should ever dare to aspire to the White House, that this is a man's world, and that it should be kept that way.
In fact, when she makes her announcement speech, she frames it in such a way that as she goes through the speech, she is coming to the conclusion, and she lists all these reasons people have told her not to run.
The odds are too heavily against me for even the most remote chance of victory. I would not have the physical stamina and strength to run. I do not have the financial resources to wage the campaign that others have. I do not have the professional political organization that others have. Absence from Washington while the Senate had roll call votes.
She says for all those reasons, that's why I am going to run. Because she realized that if women always bought into that psychology, a woman would never run. And if a woman never runs, then a woman will never be successful.
Margaret made it all the way to the Republican National Convention. In the first ballot, she got 5th place. Then on the second ballot, when many of the competitors were forfeiting, Margaret refused to. In the second ballot, she placed 2nd.
Because she wanted to be able to say, I came in 2nd. She wanted to lay down that marker for women who came after.
Shortly after the Clintons moved into the White House, Hillary Clinton was asked by Parade magazine to write a list of her role models. One of the people she singled out was none other than Margaret Chase Smith. Even if she didn't win, she still inspired many other women thereafter to run for president. Throughout her career, she was a very strong supporter of the space program.
In October of 1957, the Soviet Union put the first satellite in space called Sputnik, and that alarmed America. We had looked at the Soviet Union as being a backward technological country, but how could that be the case if they were able to put a satellite in space before the United States was able to? In Congress, what they decided needed to happen was a special committee needed to be formed. It was called the Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee. And Margaret Chase Smith and Robert Kerr were some of the first members of that. And it's that committee that helps to create NASA, which runs our space program. President Kennedy says America is going to be the first country to put a man on the moon. And that's the Apollo program. And we do pull that off in July of 1969. Apollo 11 lands on the moon, and the 2 astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, walk on the moon. And again, Margaret Chase Smith was on the Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee that oversaw those programs.
In July of 1989, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. 6 years later, she died at age 97 on May 29, 1995. Altogether, Margaret Chase Smith led the United States out of the Red Scare and left a legacy of paving the way for women in politics today.
Give it to the girls, they're heaven sent. It could be that our next president